Welcome to this event about the opening of UK Space Command. A particular welcome to our RISU members all around the world and to the people who come from the companies that sponsor our research. Big shout out to you. Now listen, back in 2015, I was part of a war game for a cabinet of a certain European power about a major security event in their capital city. The mission we were given to war game was the ability to shut down a city and make it uninhabitable within a week without using conventional or nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. Now, this was 2015, right? So what they wanted was a series of cyber attacks that would cut them down to size. Instead, we gave them a denied space environment. Society's dependence on space in any country is really significant. Precision timing determines everything from traffic music to traffic movement to energy distribution, logistics to stock and finance market. It even runs the sewage in some states. And these vulnerabilities are a bit like pandemic risks in national risk registers. Everyone knows they're there, but few people really do anything about them. Coincidentally, over the past decade, there's been a proliferation and a growth in offensive counter-space systems, which can be used to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy space systems. From electronic warfare and ASAT direct energy weapons to kinetic kill vehicles, major powers, and some less major ones too, have a proven ability to determine ownership of the high ground of contemporary battlefields. It's not just me saying that. This is from the quite good Australian Defence Strategic Update from 2020 and a similarly excellent report just released by the Secure World Foundation. The second incarnation of the US Space Command opened in August 2019. That same year, French Space Command was rebranded from their Joint Space Command, which was opened in 2010. And this is when you really know it's become an acceptable part of the military, NATO agreed to make space an operational domain in 2019. They didn't say what operationalizing space meant as part of a domain, but no one's really defined that to the satisfaction of anyone yet. So when the UK opened its own Space Command on the 1st of April 2021, the only surprise was why it had taken the UK military so long. But what can we expect? That's the title of this event and the real question behind the much hyped language used in the UK Integrated Review and the Defence Command paper. The rhetoric around space domain has been quite impressive. Significant new investment has been promised. A heady ambition has been set. A peculiar command relationship within mod structures has been announced. And as some of you may have seen at the soft launch event at the Freeman Air and Space Institute at King's on the 23rd of March, such a close relationship exists between Space Strategy Team in mod and the UK Space Command that we might wonder if there's room for any other services at all. So, how far will the UK follow the US model? Is there anything new, including cash, in recent announcements, or have we been expecting this for years? Can the UK's political ambition be realised ever in space? Has industry been brought into this already? And how can such a partnership genuinely deliver? What does this look like internationally? Can we really continue to chase the arms control language in space that was used by a previous generation? Are norms in space something going to be anything more than conforming to the misbehavior of the lowest common denominator? All this and more is coming in the next hour. To head up some of these questions and to challenge some of the busy superlatives and confusing language that's being used by the UK government and military personnel right now in relation to this new command, I'm joined by three panelists who speak English and space in equal measure. First, Alexandra Stickings, who's RUSI's own resident research fellow on space security and policy. Ali will lead with her remarks, and then she'll be followed by Victoria Sampson, who is director of the Washington office of the Secure World Foundation in Washington, DC. And to round us out with an industry perspective, Nick Smith is going to give us his perspective from Lockheed Martin. Now, each panelist is going to get 10 minutes maximum, or I'm going to cut them off, and they will make their opening remarks, and then we're into Q&A. All of this is on the record, so please use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions into the panel. They won't have time to read them. I'm going to be trying to turn those into something I can understand and give them to them. And bearing in mind, I don't speak space, you'll need to keep them in English as much as possible. I will try and pose as many as we can in the time that is available. Any failures will be mine and not our speakers. So with all that under our belts, Ali, will you start us off, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. Peter, thank you for that. What I want to do is give a little bit of a broad overview of what's been happening in space, what's kind of led us to where we are, and just highlight, I think, some of the key questions that we have when we're talking about Space Command. If someone had said to me this time last year that we were going to have a UK Space Command, I would have been shocked, actually. It's so new, and what's happened has happened very, very quickly. I think in the last five years, I suppose, we have seen more and more happening in terms of space being discussed at the highest levels of government and the military. But the last year, as I said, has I think accelerated this. So what we first saw was the appointment of Air Vice Marshal Harvey Smith as the Director of Space in the MOD. We've seen the formation of a National Space Council. We've seen the Space Landscape Review take place to look at how space is governed across HMG and what the relationships look like there. We've seen space, as Peter mentioned, play a very important role in the Integrated Review and the Defence Command Paper. And of course, what started off the Space Command conversation was the government manifesto, which talked about we will have a Space Command. And at that stage, I think there was a lot of confusion, a lot of wondering why this was included, what this was going to mean, and really what defense was going to do with it. Of course, now we have it. So we have to just accept it's here and try and understand what it is. There's no doubt that space is playing a bigger role and is recognized in defense, but what does this mean in practice? So the questions for Space Command, what is its purpose? Why is it there? What will it do? We know that space domain awareness is going to be a big part of this. It's understanding the space environment, trying to picture what is happening. And so there's a lot to do with collaboration internationally and with industry. So it'll be interesting to see how Space Command makes that a reality. We know that there is funding for an ISR constellation in low Earth orbit. This, again, not a huge surprise. We had the Carbonite satellite tested a number of years ago. Small satellites, constellations in low Earth orbit is a specialty of the UK. So that is something that defence will want to build on, the indigenous capabilities there. What that looks like, how that increases integration with allies, what gaps is it filling in terms of our observation, again is a question. A space academy to train personnel to be able to work in this area, that is very important. Again, what does that look like in practice? So there's money attached, and compared to where we were a year ago, we've obviously moved forward quite a lot, but there are gaps. There's a lot of missing detail, and I think that's what is causing some concern amongst some watchers of this, and a little bit of skepticism as to what we can expect. Now, some of this missing detail could actually be a positive because it does allow for some flexibility as we move forward. We're still at the beginning of this journey in the UK in terms of military space and in a lot of ways. So having that flexibility to figure out exactly where we're going, exactly what route we're taking. There's some overlap between Space Command itself and Space Directorate within the MOD. And again, there's some kinks to work out there, particularly in terms of that collaboration, the discussions with allies and international partners, with NATO, with Five Eyes, with industry. There's a commercial integration cell. How will SMEs be a part of that as well as the primes? How will Space Command work alongside the National Space Operations Centre on things like space domain awareness? So all of these are areas that will continue to develop. So again, having that flexibility and also learning from the experience of our allies. And I think that's a really key point here. We're not the first to do this. The US, France, Japan have all begun to establish more formal space architectures within defense. So how can we learn from them? And I think there's an important point here that I want to pick up, something that Peter mentioned, is that where does space sit? Is it an RAF or an Air Force role? Is it something all defense? And how do you balance that out? And I think there has been some concern that both the commander of UK Space Command and the director of space are both RAF officers. So what does that mean in terms of integration across defense, working with strategic command, and getting the other services fully involved and fully integrated into this work? And again, looking at our allies, how that has worked, can help point us in the right direction to ensure that we are taking the right path to make that as effective as possible. But this flexibility and this open-endedness and this lack of detail in some ways can also potentially create some problems. And one of those is the difference between space as a warfighting domain and space as an operational domain. As Peter mentioned, we have the term operational domain. No one really knows what that means. But if you look at our allies, the US has gone down much more the route of space as a warfighting domain. The rhetoric is very much along that in terms of the capabilities that it has, versus others who take it much more in that sense of operational. It's enabling, it's about the interoperability and integration of different states, and less down the route of perhaps the offensive capabilities. And so for the UK, there's a question there of how far down each road does it want to go? Which path is it going to take in terms of its future capabilities? And so not having that detail, I think just creates a little bit more concern there. This is also in terms of the UK leadership in the conversations on norms of responsible behavior that we're seeing through the United Nations. And again, when Space Command was announced, there was concern from the community, the disarmament arms control community, about the UK developing a Space Command. Some other questions that I've seen raised about this: what does this mean for the extent of UK sovereign space assets? How many are we going to have? What does it mean for the protection of non-military space assets? What's the role of the UK there? What is that engagement with the norms conversations? And we will hopefully see more detail come out in the expected National Space Strategy and Defence Space Strategy in June. But as I said, despite this more general acceptance of the role of space at the highest levels of government, there is still some skepticism on the need for a space command, what it means for the UK as a space power. Space is also important for this government, we've seen that. But governments change and their priorities change. So what's the role of Space Command and the military in space in ensuring resilience to political changes within and across government to ensure that those very important space roles stay and continue into the future? So there are a lot of questions surrounding Space Command, but these are very similar to those questions on broader UK space policy. Who do we want to be? How do we see our role? How do we balance offensive versus defensive? How do we ensure sustainability going forward? How do we ensure that we realize the benefits and the opportunities of space whilst also remaining responsible actors into the longer term? I think the next 6 months to a year is going to be really telling for a lot of these questions as we start to see what exactly UK Space Command is preparing to do. We've had a lot of talk over the last few years. I think the actions that we see now will be in the telling. I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, Ali. That's really good. Now, listen, I want to hand it over to Victoria now, who's got a really impressive report come out. You can go to the website, which we'll cover and put in the chat later, because it generally is a really good coverage. But Victoria, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. I'd like to thank RUSI for inviting me to participate in this event. I think it's a really exciting time for UK space, and I'm glad to be able to have a chance to share some thoughts I have about what I see happening right now. The Secure World Foundation is a private operating foundation focused in the United States that promotes best practices and norms of behavior to ensure the long-term sustainable use of space. We have a global cooperative approach and promote cooperation to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. So in the time I've been allotted, I'm going to talk a little bit about the threat. And then I'll talk about, over the past 2 years, we've seen the establishment of military space organizations by 4 different countries. So I'll talk a little bit about how, not including the United Kingdom, and so I'll talk a little bit about how they've chosen to incorporate their military space organizations. And then I'll end with the trends that I see emerging. So starting off, I would like to point out that the space domain is undergoing significant changes. A growing number of countries and commercial actors are becoming involved in space activities, resulting in more innovation and benefits on Earth, but also more congestion and competition in space. From a security perspective, an increasing number of countries are looking to use space to enhance their military capabilities and national security. The growing use of and reliance on space for national security has also led more countries to look at developing their own counter space capabilities that can be used to deceive, disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy space systems. The existence of counter space capabilities is not new, but the circumstances surrounding them are. Today, there are greater incentives than in the past for the development and potential use of offensive counter space capabilities, notably the growing use of space for military applications by many countries. There are also greater potential consequences from widespread use of counter space capabilities that could have global repercussions well beyond the military, affecting commercial and civil space systems upon which huge parts of the global society are dependent. So my organization, the Secure World Foundation, produces its annual open source report, Global Counter Space Capability Assessment, which analyzes capabilities being developed by multiple countries across 5 categories: direct descent, co-orbital, electronic warfare, directed energy, and cyber. It's a report just came out last week. It's 150 pages. I'm not going to go into all of it now, but just to, too long didn't read version, is that there's significant research and development on a broad range of destructive and non-destructive counter space capabilities in multiple countries. However, only non-destructive capabilities are actively being used in current military operations. As counter space technologies mature, they will most likely proliferate to other countries and potential non-state actors as well. Since 2005, there have been more than 20 tests of anti-satellite weapon systems by 4 different countries, a rate of testing that has not happened since the 1960s. In addition to attacking satellites, threats to space systems can be directed against any other segments of the space system, such as ground stations or end users. So that's just in a broad sense, that's kind of the threat we're looking at, and that's what's shaping the domain that we're looking at right now. So I'll talk a little bit about the 4 countries that have started their own version of military space organizations, and I will start with the United States. So the United States actually did have a space command. It stood up for the first time back in 1985. At that point, it was a functional combat command. In 2002, it closed down as the US refocused its efforts on homeland defense post 9/11. However, in August of 2019, it stood up a second time. This time it's a geographic combat command. Its domain starts at 100 kilometers and goes up from there, in theory, forever. Its mission is to deter aggression and conflict, defend US and allied interests, deliver space combat power, and develop ready and lethal joint warfighters. Initially, it will consist of 2 subordinate commands, each of which is comprised of already existing commands and operations centers. There's a combined force space component command, which plans, integrates, conducts, and assesses global space operations. And then there's a joint task force space defense, which conducts space superiority operations with allies and partners. So we have a space command and we have a space force. They're not the same thing. The space force was formally created in December of 2019. It follows an intense debate between a lot of people in the US national security establishment about what that force should look like, or if it should even be a force. Right now, it is a separate military service with independent towers to train, equip, and operate. However, it exists within the Department of the Air Force to reduce overhead. Currently exists only members of the US Air Force and is slowly being stood up over an 18-month period. Essentially, it is Air Force Space Command with a new hat on. 1 year after its creation, the Space Force has had about 2,000 personnel transferred into it, expects to eventually have 16,000 members. The Secretary of the Air Force has also been tasked to create a Space Force Acquisitions Council, which will assume responsibility for all military space acquisitions by fiscal year 22. All right, and then in the few minutes I have left, I'm going to talk about some of the other countries that have established their own version of military space organizations. First, I'll go with France. In July of 2019, French President Macron announced that by September of that year, France would be elevating its existing Joint Space Command within the French Air Force to be a full space command, and renaming the French Air Force to be the Air and Space Force. He said this was to ensure the development and reinforcement of their space capabilities. France's Space Command is starting off with 220 people as its staff and will eventually go to 500 when it reaches full operational capacity. Eventually, this command is intended to be responsible for all of France's space operations on the order of the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. The Ministry of the Armed Forces is going to become a space operator. The French defense minister said it's important if they want to be able to carry out real military space operations, they must develop autonomy of action. In July of 2019, France also announced its first space defense strategy. It has two goals: to increase and strengthen space situational awareness, or SSA, in order for there to be better decision making and to protect French and selected European space assets. This strategy is intended to be defensive in nature. India. In April 2019, India started a defense space agency that would coordinate the space assets of the three branches of the Indian Armed Forces and work on space protection policies for the Indian space assets. It will eventually have 200 personnel assigned to it and will incorporate the Defense Satellite Control Center and the Defense Imagery Processing Analysis Center. So it's about the same size as the French version. It was followed by the establishment in June of 2019 of the Defense Space Research Organization, which will conduct research and provide technical support to the Defense Space Agency. And then last, Japan. In August of 2019, the Japanese government announced that it was deliberating whether or not it should develop a satellite that could be used to intercept foreign threat satellites. The goal would be to make a decision, so if Japan decided to go ahead with such a capability, it could be launched by the mid-2020s. In January of last year, in 2020, Prime Minister Abe announced that Japan would be establishing its Space Domain Mission Unit in April of that year, with the goal of having it fully operational by 2022. It was indeed stood up with 20 personnel and expected to reach full operations in 2023. The Space Domain Mission Unit is expected to grow to about 100 personnel and is intended to carry out space situational awareness to protect Japanese satellites. It will be part of Japan's Air Self-Defense Force and is intended to work with both US Space Command and JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency. And then really quickly, because I know I'm getting close to the time I've been allotted, just 4 trends that I've seen established looking at all these military space organizations. They're all focusing, one, on trying to get to know more about the threat, to get a better sense of what's happening and how they should be able to respond to that. Number 2, they all focus on enhancing space situational awareness, or SSA, capabilities. And that's a key part of any space defense strategy, any really space operation, is you need to be able to see the picture and understand what's going on in order to really understand the threat, understand what the domain is doing and how your capabilities fit into it. 3, they're all intended to give military space a home within a traditional military bureaucratic superstructure. And then number 4, they're hoping to strengthen resiliency of the space capabilities of the national country. So with that, I'm at time. I'll stop now. I look forward to your questions and hearing from the panelists. Thank you very much.
Victoria, brilliant. There was loads there to get into. I've written about 30 questions that I want to get you on, but the audience has already started to get some questions in. Before we get to them, let's go to Nick.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. Nick Smith from Lockheed Martin Space. I'm the UK director. Timing's brilliant for this, so really delighted to be part of this. I mean, what's this, week 2 now for Space Command? It seems like a ripe time to be talking about them in their absence, but hopefully we can have a good discussion about the kind of things as stakeholders we're hoping to see from Space Command. There is a weight of expectation here, and I think it's palpable. I'm clearly here to offer something of an industry view. I'll do my best not to stray too far into the sort of the operational side of it as much as I'd like to, but I recognise that my perspective will come definitely from my role within Lockheed Martin, and clearly we're looking from a UK perspective at our role within Athena, looking at military SATCOM, also our role in launch. But I also have a role as a prominent role in the UK Space Security Defence Committee. So I'll try and reflect a lot of the broader thoughts from industry if I can, but clearly through the Q&A, it'd be good to hear from broader industry as well to challenge me. I think it's important, as Ali did, just to recognise the progress that's been made. I left the military late 2015 and I joined Lockheed Martin. And what was prevalent in Lockheed Martin at that time was a discussion about resilience and space protection. and how you start building products and services that inherently have that level of protection baked into them from the outset. We've done decades of investment in modeling, analysis, and thinking about the mitigations for a lot of these threats that we're now talking about openly, but have been thought about for some time. So I think, as we've all recognized, this is not new, but it's now becoming more public and more part of the public debate. And when you see what's going on now within the UK, with not only Space Command, but the Space Directorate, what we're seeing within BEIS as well, and in cross other government departments, I think it's a real mark of the progress that's been made. And the pinnacle for me, the sort of high watermark for me, was I think the tweet that came out late last year from Air Vice Marshal Smith, when he condemned the Russian ASAT attack. That's the first time I think publicly I'd seen the MOD make quite a strong statement about the threats, and a public statement about the threats. I think that was a clear statement of intent from the UK. So I think the formation of the Space Command was inevitable when you recognize the threats and the dependence on space systems, that the MOD and the military had to step up into that security role. So I think it was inevitable. But I think it's also important just to recognize the broader context of what was happening in the UK from a space perspective and a sector perspective. From 2010, there had been the case for space, and there's been a real emphasis on using the space sector for economic growth and prosperity, which meant actually the political interest in trying to grow space capability was there as well. And I think the two have been symbiotic, and that's what's led to this sort of momentum growing. And I think it's important to recognize that. It's important to recognize it for a couple of reasons, I think. One is, I think the dual use nature of space means that policy decisions need to take both sides into account, probably more than they do in maybe other sectors as well. I mean, interesting debating point. I think the change in the industry has also seen that actually the barrier to entry for adversaries has dropped as well. We are seeing a proliferation of space services that our adversaries can use. And I think as well, we're going to start seeing a number of these new companies setting up, or space operators setting up in the commercial sector, that can have an expectation of space security from institutions and agencies like the MOD or other government departments as well. So question of this is what to expect. Well, thankfully, we don't need to predict, because like any good new military department or grouping, they've got a really active Twitter account, and I've done a good trawl of the Space Command Twitter account, and they've laid out exactly what the mission is, and I think they're given 7 sort of key roles they're going to do. So, we don't need to do too much of a prediction. And I have to say, this is meant to be disparaging. I think that's actually a really good Twitter account. We'll come on to something else that I would like to see from them. I think we've seen the official statements as well. They talk about the 3 functions of Space Command: space operations, workforce training and growth, and space capability, which reflects what Space Force have done with their Space Commands. I think there's anything really earth-shattering in there. There's some interesting things that will be raised by this notion that C2 of all space capabilities will be done by Space Command, including Skynet. I know from an industry perspective, there's some interest in what that means. And does that mean every future space system will come to Space Command? I think there's some questions we'd like to get into there as well. But I'm just going to offer some things that I would like to see personally as an industry stakeholder in this. And I'll try and avoid too much doctrinal talk or anything, I'll just as it comes to me. One is, the role of operational integration, clearly going to be a role with the Space Command. How do you normalize space into a broader campaign? I think what's going to be interesting from industry is how do you integrate commercially provided services into that? I think we'll get some questions on that. I think it's a challenge for a lot of these space commands. We've already mentioned the commercial integration cell in the Space Operations Center. What more will we see from that integration, and how do we make sure that industry we're enabled to do that and incentivized? Skills, we've talked about the Space Academy already, but interestingly, the whole force concept they've talked about in some of their talks so far talks about the role involvement of civilian and commercial personnel in that whole force construct. What does that look like? Are we going to see something as innovative as what they've done with cyber, which I think has been an interesting case study? I'd like to see something like that, because I think when you look at the skills that are available and the skills shortage in certain areas, it may be the only way to make this happen. One thing, and just to carry on with the alliteration, because if you look through the Space Command Twitter feed, there's huge alliteration so far. It's about coherence and capability and coalitions and capability. I'm going to carry on with the C's. Confidence and clarity is something to look for. And when we look at all these new governance organizations within the UK government, with DFT, with UK Space Agency, with BEIS, Space Directorate, Space Command, I think understanding the boundaries between these different organizations, I think is going to be really important. We try and drive the confidence in the sector to see the inward investment, to see the investment in R&D. And it's interesting, MSI did a study back in November 2018. One of their findings was actually some of the disparate nature of governance was creating a non-conducive environment for economic growth as well. So I think we'll be careful that we don't create too much governance. Communications, I think that's one thing I'd like to see from the Space Command. I think communicating with the public, I think, is important to try and make sure the debate is understood when we make these investments. I think it's always been a challenge for space to try and show the public about their dependency on space. I don't think it's well understood. I think it's important to communicate to our allies as well about, and I think that comes through very largely, but we're looking for deterrence through alliances. I think we can be very important. I think from a deterrence perspective, clearly communicating with our adversaries about what we're trying to do and how that operational advantage comes in. But more than that, from a sector perspective, is communication with the sector. We'd like to see that from Space Command as well. And then I guess the big one is going to be capability. We've heard before this, there's 1.4 billion over 10 years, which was in the integrated review. There is a number of different programs in there, but what does that actually mean? It doesn't feel like it's significant space programs, or maybe we're missing something. And I think there'll be lots of questions that comes out of that. But what we do have, which I think is really exciting for the first time, is we've got a clear customer role in the space domain now. Before there have been programs that have had space solutions, but now there is a clear customer voice for that space role and setting up some of those requirements. A classic example of that is who sets the theatre entry standard for Skynet when it's developed? Will there be a demand on future commercial providers to have done something inherent from a resilience perspective in their own product before they can sell back into the military, much like cyber as well. We've already talked about the integration of commercial services. I think that'll be incredibly important from a capability perspective. Multi-role platforms, how do you set the requirements and work across a number of different mission areas to try and enable that multi-role platform? I think an interesting one in there will also be potentially the opportunity to think about trades. Where might you be able to trade an air breathing platform for a space platform, and how do you drive some of that coherence? I think the other one that I think will be really important, this cuts across some of the areas from a capability perspective, is will you start thinking about things like common ground architectures? If you're having a number of different space systems, do you just need one ground architecture? What does that look like? I think the other challenge is going to be acquisition reform. Do we have the facilities and the infrastructure to be able to do these large-scale space acquisitions? Right now, space is taking place, the acquisition of space is taking place in lots of different areas, but how do you bring that together? And I know that's recognized, and I think from an industry perspective, we're keen to see more on that. So just to finish off then, so we've got plenty of time for questions. I think, I hope at this point, if there are Space Command representatives watching, I hope they feel that weight of expectation that I think all in the sector have. We've seen a lot of change over the last few years, as Ali laid out, but it feels like now we've gone through that period of planning. We've gone through that period of putting in place the governance and those things that you need to be able to take the next steps. We're now clearly waiting for the national space strategy and the follow-up defense space strategy. We've been waiting for that for some time. We know it's coming soon, which is really exciting, and hopefully that will galvanize all of these things we've been discussing. But the feeling is now, you've done the planning, we've done that pre-planning. Now's the time for execution. I think that's what we're really expecting from Space Command, is that organization and a space commander who can really take forward on some of these ambitions, and we're keen to be part of that. So that's my pitch.
Nick, thanks very much, and thank you to all our speakers. It's been a really good intro to it. Listen, before we get into the questions, and they're flowing in, there's loads of them, and we'll get to them. I'm struck by something that Neil Fraser started with about the bounded vision. Just because we've got two stars, both RAF, both fast jet pilots, blah blah blah. But the whole language of what we've heard feels a bit last century, and indeed reading the Defence Command paper and the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy, it feels as if we're trying to deal with processes and approaches that are maybe 5 years old or older. So we're talking about sovereignty as at the same time we're trying to talk about resilience without placing the financial resource with it. We're talking about military commercial structures, which in many ways we've had for quite a long time through the Skynet contract. And we're talking about replacement of small satellites, when in fact we've been pretty good at large satellites. We're talking about Skynet 6 and then enduring capabilities while we're still trying to figure out what the budgets are. I mean, it feels fairly confused, but behind all of this, it feels to me like we should be we should be, pushing into a brave new world of stuff rather than falling back on some of the stuff that we think transfers automatically from another domain simply because it's military. And I wonder if the panel thinks that there is a risk that by militarizing the space problem, that we're going to make it worse rather than better. And I say this with, a reflection on cyber, where, if we use that example of a sort of a new domain, as the UK wanted to call it 5 years ago, that GCHQ was doing pretty well in it. You introduced the military, and we added a lot of process and clunk and language into that, which could have been done with simplicity had we just adapted to theirs. Now, so the question for each of the panelists is really, are there lessons that we can learn from the approach of other states and other programs that would allow us to do this more easily, rather than simply overlaying domain and single service thinking on top of what is a fairly new environment? So Ali, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's I wish you hadn't come to me first, because I've got quite a lot to think about there. Just in terms of these questions being a bit old, I mean, the UK has been grappling with some of this for a long time, and I think so some of those questions have just endured. Whilst other things have moved on, we're still kind of, because we didn't deal with them 10, 15 years ago, there is a sense of maybe that pulling through. I've been quite vocal at times in whether we should be calling space a domain in the military sense, and whether we should be approaching it in the same way. Because so much of it, yes, there are some similarities, so much of it is different. We have different actors. We have a commercial sector that is in some ways going to be taking over in terms of numbers of satellites, in certain capabilities. I do have some concern, to be honest, about the extent to which space is militarized, not in the sense of the environment being militarized with weapons and fighting, but the underlying structure of it, that we're militarizing how we're approaching space, that maybe is holding us back a little bit from new ways of working, from new ways of approaching it, that could potentially allow us to act and adapt better to the changes that we're seeing there, and instead of maybe bringing some of the problems that we have in the traditional domains into that. Are we going to make it worse? I don't know. I mean, we know that there are challenges there anyway, but I think that there's potentially an argument to be made that a slightly different approach could be beneficial. And that's me basically sitting on the fence and not wanting to give a strong answer either way.
Well, listen, let me come to Victoria now and say, listen, everything you outlined about the other states, most of them seem to have tried this for a period of 10 years, decided they got it slightly wrong, but instead of morphing their approach, they shut down their organization and then restarted another one that they thought would have the right approach. Is that right, or I'm mischaracterizing people shutting down and these individual organizations, Victoria?
Well, I mean, that's true for the United States, but again, that was a different approach that we had, from a couple decades ago. India, France, and Japan, those are all new within the past few years. But your basic point that you asked about, militarizing space is, is this affecting it? I think it's a really interesting one, because space is so inherently dual use, and which means, the assets can be used for commercial, can be used for defense, they can be used for civil. A lot of it, the technology is a technology. It's the intent that makes a big difference. And so I think oftentimes, the saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If the military has been given a threat, they're going to have a military approach to it. One of the things I found really interesting in just preparing for this panel, I went and looked up the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have a satellite database. It's a really great open source database that talks about, what we know about everyone's satellites. The UK has 167 satellites in that database that are said to be UK owned and operated. Most of those are OneWeb. Of those, the 167 satellites, 5 are MOD. So, I mean, it's a big difference. You say, okay, well, what is what is the UK's responsibility? What is their role? Are they there to only do the military defense? Are they there to provide a stable domain for all actors? Is there a commercial response? And I think the important thing to remember is that there are a lot of tools in the toolkit you can use to handle this sort of thing. And I will congratulate the United Kingdom for their leadership in the United Nations for trying to shift the discussion towards norms of behavior and responsibility, as opposed to trying to deal with treaties or things that have just been stalled for decades now. I think that has a lot of potential. And so I think there's just many tools in the toolkit that could be used to really make sure that space is a stable and predictable domain.
Thanks, Victoria. Nick, I mean, are there, there has in many ways been a really good partnership between the MOD and the consortiums operating Skynet that have given the MOD some real flexibility in the use of space assets, as well as some income earning potential to the companies that have been operating the satellites to use the spare capacity, right? And it feels to me like that was quite a good model of military civil cooperation. But I mean, you hinted at this idea of almost a Maltese breaststroke, that all command and control will be run by space command. It strikes me that we're reverting to a military way that is less flexible than we've had in the past. Do you think that's true, or do you just think this is something we're bound to have, and then we'll get through the conversation and be fine?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, isn't it? Because we're conflating a number of issues here. I think acquisition reform across the MOD has always been a challenge. Thinking about how do you do procurement of technology at the rate it's coming in at. I think you can ask that question in any sector at all. I think it's interesting to make a comparison to what we've seen previously in space. I think the flexibility you talked about wasn't the driving factor for going into that arrangement, but I think there has been an element of that that's come out of it. And I think this shared investment and risk across industry and the MOD and broader government, especially in dual use systems like space, where there is opportunity for that, I think is one to be considered. Is there a better model? I'm not sure there is. And I think the pendulum will keep swinging. I mean, what we're seeing now is the MOD have recently put out an RFI for future acquisition models, thinking about the future Skynet program. So they are clearly thinking about what might be the right model. We're seeing this in a number of areas as well. Will you be able to realize those? I mean, it's always tough, I think, to try and understand where the financial liability and how you put those commercial constructs in place and how you incentivize it. That's always difficult, especially in the existing construct that exists right now for government procurement. So I think it feels like that's possibly, it's possibly a step too far too quickly, but I think it's a challenge that's worth coming out. I think space possibly, because of its dual use nature, definitely is a domain where you can have those debates. So
and even where you're talking about dual use nature and the cost of acquisition, the cost of entry coming down, actually this is still it's a really expensive business. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate that. And what I just would is this idea of sovereignty over assets, commercial, military owned and operated together in partnership. This idea of sovereignty, redefining that came out in the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy, and then the idea of new partnerships. You talked about Australia and Japan, a new group of operators that all want a bit of sovereignty, that all want lots of resilience and perhaps can't afford for it. Are we going to have to see new models that not only deal with this commercially and militarily, but they're also going to have to update our understanding of sovereignty in an industrial sort of language?
And I think it's my personal view is I think we've already seen those models. I mean, you can look across what we do in the ISR domain, and I think we see those models, there quite well. And so I don't think these are necessarily new models that we need to create or not. I think they exist there. Possibly not quite that commercial. I think we possibly did a better job of the sort of commercial industrial, the industrial military boundary sort of many decades ago, but that's usually driven by the existential need from campaigns or warfare. So there's probably something to do with how we build those structures. But I think models for sovereignty, I think, do exist. And you look at something like the air seeker capability and how that operates, and even from a Lockheed Martin perspective, the F-35, and how actually there is a strong prosperity link to that. There's the operational advantage link to that as well, which is delivering a UK national capability with sovereignty, but also in partnership with our key allies. So I think there are some models we can look to, and I think they can be applied to space. I think one of the challenges we're seeing, though, is about whether there is that inherent deep understanding of the capabilities in the domain to be able to make those decisions or not. I think people that have made those decisions previously, especially when it comes to freedom of action, operating advantage, have grown up in that domain and understand it incredibly well to the point where they understand the nuance. I think that's something that the MOD is just having to relearn from sort of years ago, and it's just have to go through that process. I think we're probably just seeing a bit of that to be able to make what that decide what that definition is.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. Now, listen, we've got quite a few questions. I'm going to try and group some of these together, and a lot of them seem to be about ordering. And I mean this in sort of military terms, because we've got some talking about capabilities, about should it be ISR first, should it be space situational awareness first, what capabilities should look like. But there's this great question that came out from Uring at the Ruhr University, and they're talking there about, actually, do you know what? We kind of need a sort of concept of operation, a strategy, a plan, some tactics before we get into understanding exactly what we need. Is there a feeling that, as most states, they've rushed into getting capability? We want to show we're, it's a bit like India. We want to show we're a first world nation, chuck up a load of satellites, and then we'll shoot one or two down because that, that'll scare the Chinese. Are we in danger of rushing into this, where actually we need a more considered approach? I'm not aware that the UK has an idea of what its force structure, its force laydown looks like in space. Ali, does it?
No, not particularly. I think when it comes to thinking about what space capabilities we need, there are two parts to the question. The first question is on requirements, and you look at what does space enable. So take, comms, ISR, PNT. You look at your comms requirements across defense. You've got an architecture there that is, in multi-domains. Where does space play a role in that? Where does a space segment fit into that? That is how you start to think, okay, what do we need to develop? Within that, you have allies. What do we get from our allies? What can we rely on? Where are the gaps? Where can we play a role to support not only ourselves, but also those alliances? So those are the questions. And you do that for each of those capabilities. You do that for comms. You think about ISR. We rely on the US for a lot of our ISR capabilities. Where might the US be looking to prioritize in the future? What does that mean for, geographically, if they're focusing more on the Pacific? Is there more that needs to be done by European states in terms of Northern Europe? What's the role of the UK in terms of NATO? So that's how you start to build up those requirements and the integration of your space segment into the broader defense architectures. So that's the first part in terms of determining what do we actually need to acquire? What hardware do we need? And then we put them up. Once they're up there, then you get onto the second part of the question, which is how do we protect them? So it's building resilience in through the supply chain, from the beginning. What do we need to do in terms of space domain awareness? Again, internationally with commercial partners to understand what's happening, to understand the threats, to be able to potentially attribute acts, to understand what response might look like, to replace satellites. And at the far end of that spectrum is the more offensive side of the potential denial of disruption of other satellites. So there are two parts of it. There's no point having lots of defense in space if you don't have anything to defend, because you've determined that actually you can just continue to rely on the US for everything. But on the other side, there is that, the UK has been very clear about wanting to be a much more important and respected international space actor. And so there's a feeling that, well, if we don't have satellites, how can we do that? If we don't have our own launch capability, how can we be that? So there's a worry of just saying, we're going to do this because, look, it shows how great we are, and then we're supporting our indigenous industry and we're doing all this. The danger is that you end up with, a constellation of white elephants orbiting that aren't necessarily providing any real capability, that aren't plugging those gaps, and it hasn't been through that. And then you're wasting money. So a considered approach that goes along that journey is required. I'm just not sure that, and that takes time too. So I'm not sure how much that will be done.
Sure, but we've had our own astronaut, right? We've had Major Tim Peake, or he should be obviously squadron leader Tim Peake if he was RAF, but he's not. Obviously, he's British Army Air Corps. Maybe should take command of Space Command. But Victoria, have we had others? When you look at the US model, when you look at the Indian model, when you look at the Japanese model, have they done this idea of coming up with a strategy, a plan first of what they want at a sort of national level, and then resourcing that, or have they just gone into it knowing it's important and doing action first, and then we'll sort the rest of it out later?
I'd say it's more the latter. The idea that, well, we need to have something, we'll create it and we'll figure it out as we go along. I mean, there's something to be said for that sort of thinking, and that, if you have a military space organization, you're going to have to fund it and you're going to have to figure out what it's doing, whereas you could have studies forever trying to figure out what your strategy is. But I think the important thing is to really think about, what problem are you trying to solve? And that's really going to shape how you approach your response. And I don't like to sound like a broken record, but I really feel like SSA, space situational awareness, is extremely important to be able to figure out, okay, what is the domain looking like? What activities are we seeing? How can we call out bad behavior? What's even normal behavior? I think it's really important to be able to share into that information. That's a key part of this as well. One of the big things I
can I just come back? Can I just come back to that, very Victoria? If all these people, our allies, are doing that now, why can't we just check? Why can't we take a feed off them? Why do we need to redo that ourselves?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily reinventing the wheel, but I think there's definitely new capabilities that can be brought in. For one thing, there are satellites being operated by the United Kingdom or by UK entities. You guys have owner-operator data. That's always better than what you can pick up via the radars and telescopes, which means you could input to a system that's much more accurate and make the SSA data more accurate as a result and make it stronger as a net benefit. So I think that's one way that could be going about doing it. But yeah, the other thing I was going to say really quickly, because I know we're close on time, are you trying to deter threats? That's something that I see a lot from military space organizations. To be honest, I'm still not quite clear how the existence of a military space organization deters a threat. Its mere existence doesn't do it. You have to have some sort of capability of response in order to do that. And then finally, on the US side, one of the biggest arguments for establishing a Space Force was that military space acquisition was broken and needed to be fixed. And before the US Space Command and US Space Force were created, there were 60 organizations within the US government that had input to military space acquisition. Now we have 60 plus Space Command, plus Space Force, plus the Space Development Agency. So we didn't actually fix the problem we were trying to solve. So that would be my recommendation, is really figure out what problem you're trying to solve, and is this the best way to go about doing it? Thank you.
Really great. But luckily for the UK, we have the Space Council, so everything will be fine. Isn't that right, Nick?
Yes. Is that the answer you wanted?
That's exactly it. Now, listen, now, one of the things I wanted to get to, Nick, this is
Yep.
for you and Ali, I guess, is about people. And lots of the questions that come in are about people. It's about, in many ways, part of this is questions very specifically about the reservist part of this. Part of this is really about growing the skill set, not just in Space Command, but in each of the single services, such that they can be the intelligent second customer, so they can ask the questions that set the requirements for Space Command in many ways. Part of it is being about, the warfighter, the commander in many ways, who needs to know what he can get from space and ask the right questions. Again, a failure of how we in the military have dealt with cyber in many ways. Part of this is about industry, and how we can swap in and out of industry to gain that knowledge. Because I think whilst we say the space sector is huge in the UK, actually for the expertise we want, it's pretty small at the moment, right?
Yeah, and I know there's work going on at the moment to try and really think about the skills challenge that I think exists in the space sector. A couple of things I'll just talk about there. One is, I think this notion about trying to be able to share skills, I think, is incredibly important as we go forward, especially if you start seeing a number of different agencies within the UK going through major acquisition. What if the UK Space Agency retains ownership of the space-based PNT program. That moves into a major program. They'll be calling on all of the same acquisition support that, of course, is in the MOD right now, thinking about Skynet. How do you really think about how you're going to do both the program management, but then the acquisition of some of these things? I think it's going to be a challenge there. And of course, industry has been fighting for the same people as well. And that, I think we've got to find a way of just trying to improve that cross-pollination of skills. And as someone who's clearly ex-military and now in industry, I would really welcome the opportunity to think about how we can do that in the future. I think one thing I would say is we've seen this across a number of nations as well, and I'm sure we're not alone in this, but Lockheed Martin, we've done everything from training some of our partners right the way from how to build and acquire satellites, right the way through to the high end of operations. It's not just the UK that's challenged this. Number of nations which have really large, sort of much larger sectors, still have the same challenges as well. So it's not just here. So the opportunity is there, I think, to do this. And I do wonder whether there is something to learn from cyber. So that'd be my perspectives.
Ali.
Yeah, I think space is one of those areas that in terms of skills and expertise, we do have to approach it a bit differently, and really lean on the skills within industry and other sectors. And I think that the idea of reservists who can bring that long-term expertise in is something that Space Command should definitely be pursuing. I think they are, but continue to do that. For those of us who follow space, you always think you know everything, and then it turns out, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. There's complexities, like Nick said, everything from the hardware, the building a satellite, through, the politics around launch, all the way through, SSA and operational. And I mean, we need people who are going to be able to sort of sit across a lot of that. And so bringing in, the expertise from outside, I think, positive that there will be this space academy. We don't know, again, the detail exactly how much of that 1.5 billion, I think it is 1.5 billion over 10 years. That's including ISR, that's including SDA, space domain awareness. So how much of that will be to Space Academy? How is education for space in general done across defense? Because we need those people in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, everyone, there has to be an understanding, at least at a basic level, of what they get from space, what the vulnerabilities are, what they do in if they happen to lose it. So again, it's this, there's a multi-pronged approach to it, but having some flexibility in that, and really leaning on the expertise in the commercial sector, internationally. Again, we are part of alliances, so there are ways to do this through Five Eyes, through NATO, to work together to ensure that we have that expertise across the alliances instead of just focusing on the UK.
Ali, thanks very much. And we're going to have to draw stumps there because we're coming to the end of our time. Listen, there have been a phenomenal number of questions that come in, and we're going to have to run. I'm going to give Ali a task now to run another of these sessions sometime before the summer. There's a whole lot of questions that have come about, as usual, as you'd expect. Quantum AI is going to solve everything in space. What reality? We can cover that in about 5 minutes. But the big question that people have is about the arms control question of behaviors in space. And I think this is really interesting. There's obviously an appetite in the audience out there. Ali, we'll put something on, right? Sometime before July, we'll put on another of these events because there's also a real appetite. But thank you so much to the panel. It's been really good. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. And I apologize. It's my failure, not theirs, that we never got through them. And they were really good questions as well. We'll trawl through them, and we won't be able to get to any of them. But I promise at some stage we'll try and do that again. But thank you all very much. Please do check out our space page at RUSI.org. You'll find lots of interesting stuff there, mostly written by Ali, that gives you a view over where we think it is. And we look forward to having a space conference to talking more about this stuff come the autumn. But from RUSI, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.